In the damp, malaria-ridden forests of western Michigan during the late 1840s, a community of exhausted Dutch immigrants was fighting simply to stay alive in a harsh new world. The deepest threat to survival was not the wilderness, but an agonizing question: how could they build lives here without losing the absolute purity of their historic faith? The historical evolution of American Protestantism balances cultural accommodation and theological preservation, beautifully exemplified by the intense 19th century transatlantic Dutch Calvinist movement that settled the Midwest. The Great Dutch Fracture of 1857, which birthed the Christian Reformed Church, was the slow maturation of ideological seeds planted decades earlier during intense state suppression in the Netherlands. The immigrants who settled the Midwest were deeply principled religious dissenters, not typical economic migrants, whose entire worldview was forged through decades of fierce, uncompromising theological resistance. Their subsequent clash with the long-established Reformed Church in America highlights the severe difficulties of religious acculturation, pitting European traditions against the shifting realities of American life. Ultimately, we traces how European state suppression directly fueled the foundational fracturing of this immigrant community in Michigan, cementing a powerful, permanent, and distinct transatlantic Reformed identity. The theological blueprint for the 1857 fracture was drawn over 20 years prior across the Atlantic. In 1816, the Dutch government placed the Nederlands Hervormde Kerk under direct state supervision. This administrative restructuring granted the monarchy unprecedented authority over ecclesiastical governance. The royal decree effectively transformed ministers into civil servants working directly under secular oversight. Orthodox believers viewed this as a betrayal of the historic Reformation. They argued that secular oversight introduced spiritual compromise and Enlightenment rationalism at the expense of rigorous, experiential Calvinism. This unrest culminated in the Afscheiding, or secession, of 1834. Led by Hendrik de Kock, a localized protest evolved into a powerful national movement of absolute religious independence. Alongside zealous ministers like Hendrik Schulte and Albertus van Raalte, de Kock led congregations out of the state church. This defiance sought to resurrect the ancient, pristine orthodoxy. This bold movement sought to resurrect the pristine orthodoxy codified at the historic Synod of Dort in 1619, separating believers from a body they firmly deemed to be confessionally unfaithful. The Dutch government responded with swift, punitive measures. Because the Constitution guaranteed freedom of worship only to recognized bodies, the independent assemblies were officially deemed unauthorized by the state. Authorities levied heavy financial penalties, imprisoned dissenting ministers, and subjected ordinary believers to social ostracism and the forced quartering of troops directly inside their private domestic family homes. By the 1840s, this systemic political pressure converged with catastrophic socio-economic conditions. These disasters included a devastating potato blight, cholera outbreaks, and severe flooding across the entire native countryside. The seceders interpreted these afflictions as divine judgment upon an unfaithful nation. To their minds, these compounding hardships served as a clear, undeniable signal from God to depart the country. Unlike typical economic migrants, these pioneers emigrated en masse as fully formed, highly disciplined congregations. They were deeply bound by shared suffering and an intense, uncompromising piety of faith. They carried a deep-seated distrust of centralized authority and a fierce vigilance against cultural interference. They had already sacrificed social standing and financial stability for absolute doctrinal purity. They arrived in the American wilderness with a battle-tested framework for secession. This cultural precedent rendered institutional separation a natural, justifiable action whenever their core theological values were threatened by external compromise. The geographic dispersion of the Afscheiding immigrants established two distinct Midwestern centers of Dutch life in 1847. In Iowa, Reverend Hendrik Schulte led his followers toward rapid economic and political integration. Concurrently, Reverend Albertus Van Raalte led a large contingent into the dense forests of western Michigan, founding the colony of Holland. He envisioned a self-sustaining Christian society protected from worldly corruption. However, the harsh Michigan wilderness brought extreme poverty, isolation, exhaustion, and deadly disease. These brutal conditions pushed the young colony to the brink of collapse. Recognizing that absolute isolation was unsustainable, Van Raalte sought external aid. This brought him into contact with the Reformed Church in America, an established East Coast denomination that responded with extraordinary financial aid, provisions, and moral support. To Van Raalte, this partnership was a providential mechanism to save his colony. He perceived a natural theological alignment, believing the RCA's adherence to the three forms of unity mirrored the strict orthodoxy of the secession. This relationship culminated in a formal ecclesiastical alignment in 1850, merging the newly organized Classis of Holland into the particular Synod of Albany. For the RCA, this injected a vibrant, devout population into a denomination struggling to expand westward. Initially, Van Raalte expressed deep satisfaction, finding the RCA's confessional history compatible with his own theological training. Beneath the surface harmony, deep structural tensions developed immediately. Many immigrants felt the union had been rushed by leadership without congregational input. These skeptical laypeople and pastors viewed the wealthy, English-speaking Eastern churches not as faithful brethren, but as a thoroughly Americanized body that had accommodated modern cultural norms. To their eyes, the RCA had drifted far from the rigorous countercultural purity they had suffered to protect in the Netherlands, setting the stage for deep-seated estrangement. The dissatisfaction among Michigan immigrants soon crystallized into explicit non-negotiable objections regarding the day-to-day religious practices of the RCA. Dissenting colonists pointed out that many RCA congregations had quietly abandoned mandatory catechism preaching. They noted that this abandonment removed a cornerstone of the European secession, ensuring systematic doctrinal instruction. Furthermore, they noted a widespread neglect of regular annual pastoral family visitations, which the Afscheiding tradition viewed as indispensable for maintaining moral accountability. Worship and sacraments became intense theological battlegrounds. For strict separatists, biblical psalms constituted the sole authorized manual for public praise. They viewed humanly authored hymns as an alarming compromise, introducing uninspired ideas into the sanctuary. Additionally, immigrants grew deeply disenchanted with the RCA's practice of open communion, which allowed members from other Christian denominations to participate in the Lord's Supper without direct examination by the local consistory. The most explosive grievance, however, concerned membership in secret societies, specifically the Freemasons. While the Afscheiding churches firmly barred anyone associated with secret lodges, the RCA tolerated Freemasons within its membership and clergy. To the immigrants, this polluted the purity of Christ's visible body. To the immigrant mind, these liturgical variations were symptoms of a systemic infection, cultural assimilation. Rapid Americanization was viewed as a direct hazard to their historic faith. They perceived 19th century American evangelicalism as overly Methodistic, elevating human emotion and free will above the sovereign grace and confessional boundaries of historic Calvinism. This stood in sharp contrast to traditional Afscheiding practice, where rigorous intellectual catechism classes were replaced by the pragmatism of the Sunday school, and deep doctrinal pulpit exposition gave way to topical, moralistic discourses. Furthermore, systematic pastoral house visitations were abandoned for corporate prayer meetings. Influential voices advocated for intentional protective isolation. They asserted that spiritual separation was a necessary measure to preserve their convictions before engaging with broader American life. This momentum towards secession was validated by the historical precedent of the true Reformed Dutch Church secession of 1822, led by Solomon Froelij. This parallel demonstrated that institutional laxity had previously forced even Native American Calvinists to choose separation. Armed with this justification, The dissenting consistories adopted a conditional view of the 1850 Union. They argued the merger was a fraternal alliance based on shared historic standards. Because the RCA failed to uphold these standards in practice, the separating congregations felt no moral obligation to remain within a compromised institutional framework. By the winter of 1857, the accumulation of doctrinal grievances, cultural anxieties, and historical justifications reached a point of institutional crisis. The structural dissatisfaction within the classes of Holland could no longer be contained by appeals to denominational unity. In a series of formal declarations delivered to the classis meeting, the fracture became an official reality. 4 prominent congregations, alongside a handful of independent groups, formally announced their withdrawal from the Reformed Church in America. Led by determined clerical voices like Reverend Coen van den Bosch, these self-described seceders completely severed their ties with the Eastern Synod and re-established themselves as an independent body. In May of 1857, the representatives of these separating churches held their initial classical assembly. They did not view themselves as innovators creating a new sect, but rather as restorers recovering a stolen legacy. They explicitly reconstituted their union on the absolute authority of God's Word, the historic confessional standards of the Reformed Church of the Netherlands, and the strict ecclesiastical governance outlined in the Church Order of Dort. This historic gathering marked the formal birth of what would eventually be known throughout American history as the Christian Reformed Church. This institutional division caused immense personal and communal pain throughout the colonies. Reverend Albertus von Raalte, who had poured his life into the material and spiritual survival of the Western Michigan settlement, fiercely opposed the schism. He viewed the separation as a short-sighted act of ingratitude. The split exposed deep social and regional fault lines within the immigrant populace, dividing those from insular agricultural provinces from those of cosmopolitan backgrounds. The Great Fracture thus permanently divided the Dutch immigrant community into 2 distinct ecclesiastical camps, setting them on separate paths of development for generations to come. As the dust settled on the historic Classical Assembly of May 1857, the newly formed independent churches stood entirely alone in the American wilderness. They had successfully guarded their theological identity, but they had also severed ties with the wealthy established networks that ensured their physical survival. They were a tiny, fragmented minority facing an immense, unfamiliar continent. The immediate future of this fragile communion appeared bleak, filled with the quiet realization that ideological purity often carries a heavy material price. Neighbors were pitted against neighbors, and families were divided down the middle over which side of the ecclesiastical fence to occupy. Van Raalte's established dream of a unified, prosperous colony lay in ruins, leaving the seceders to navigate systemic isolation and economic vulnerability without an obvious path forward. By what means could this fragile, isolated cluster of congregations possibly survive the structural pressures of their new homeland? Join us tomorrow for Part 2, The Great Dutch Fracture of 1857, Crisis, Growth, and Modern Horizons, where an unexpected institutional earthquake in the 1880s and a massive wave of transatlantic migration would fundamentally alter the destiny of the Dutch Calvinist movement in America.